Hi everyone, welcome to part 2 of getting started with SolidJS in the TMDB example. So in this video, I want to go through the UI section. Hopefully you watched the previous video and saw how we made API calls to get the data for the page. And now I want to walk through some of the components and the rendering of this page. So here it is in its completion. We have some text up here. We have the SolidJS logo, TMDB logo. We have rows of images. And we can navigate down. We have, this is the hero component. We have another row of images, another row, another hero component, and then down to the bottom. And then we can navigate back up. And lastly, I can press left and pull up the left nav. So let's look at how this is actually written in the code to give an example of how to do this yourself. So again, this is part of the Solid demo app. It's open source, you can check it out. And if I go now into the app, I'm going to start at the very top. So again, we have a router. We are looking at the TMDB page, which is the route we're on. The preload is calling the API data, passing it into the TMDB component. And I want to also mention, so the hash router has a page wrapper, which is our app. So the app component gets loaded. And then inside of the app component, there is a props.children. Where is props.children? There it is. And so this is the TMDB page gets injected into props.children. So we have all of this stuff happening on the outer of the page, and then our TMDB component gets put into here. And here is our TMDB page. And the first thing I want to emphasize is the TMDB page is just a function. All components with SolidJS are just functions. So this is just the functions. It's receiving props, which again was props.tmdb or props.data was our TMDB data, and then we're creating the UI. So a couple things I want to mention. The first thing is the TMDB component is initialized once, and this is a SolidJS pattern, is when you create a TMDB component, and every component that you create, all of this stuff at the top gets executed once. So it will create this. This will then be in local scope. So we got a signal, we got some variables, we got a create effect, some more function, and then we're returning our template. So this is our actual UI code that we're going to go through. One important thing with JSX syntax, so if you're familiar with React or SolidJS, you can only return one single node. So you would have to have one top level node that you're returning, or if you have multiple nodes and you want them to be siblings, you can return a fragment, and then you can put whatever children you want inside of there, and you're still returning a single node. This is just a fragment is what this is called. Okay, so we're going to start at the very top here and just walk through this code. This block here is our built with solid word TMDB logo and a little bit of text here. And again, Solid offers two primitives, view and text, and that's it. There's a row and a column component that's built on top of view and text, but view and text are your building blocks. And so if I put these side by side here, which I think this makes the most sense, drag this over, we have this built with SolidJS logo, TMDB, and that is this block here. So if I just take this, comment this out real quick, save it, you'll notice it disappears, and then I'll bring it back, save it again, pops right back in. And the important thing is every view and text is position absolute within its container. So when I set the width and I set the height and I set the x position is the x position based on its parent container. So I can move this all the way over to, let's say 500, save it, and you see the whole thing just shifted over. And that's a very important concept. If you're coming from HTML, you can just consider everything a div and consider everything position absolute inside of its parent container. So once you have this parent container at 500, this is x of 80 offset of the 500. So you'll notice it's still inside its parent container, but its new x value is just 80 off of its parent container. And that's essentially it. Like every block you're deciding this is the width, this is the height, and these are the XY coordinates of that block. Text element, you can just put some text inside of it, but we are gonna skip through this very quickly, but this is a basic, like here is solid with hello world. I'm gonna just delete this just to make it easier to look at the rest of the stuff. So now we get into our first component, which is our content block. And the content block is Moana 2 and the description for Moana 2. So apparently Moana 2 is the most popular movie now in December. We're passing in an XY coordinate and we're passing in the content that we wanted to display. So if we want to look at content block, I'm going to control click or command click on this and it will jump into the content block definition. Again, this is just a function. So one of the important things here is this is a view tag and I am spreading the props. So I can pass in any number of arguments here, and by spreading the props, this ref, the X, Y, and the content is now set on that view component. So now it's using the XY coordinates that I set here. If you don't do that, or you're like, my ref isn't working, it's probably because you did not spread the props, which means it's not setting all the properties onto the view component. So now that I have this, I'm passing in props.content. So now I can see props.content.title, description, vote count, and all of this stuff is just going through. These are, again, more components. If it's not a view or a text, then it is a component that you've written or I've written. So here we can just jump to headline, and you can see how simple the headline component is. It's just a function returning the text with the headline styles. And I think that's one important thing to note is with this, there is a style system. So right now you can set any properties you want on the view component, or all of these properties can be put inside of an object, and it's the same names, same variables. You can put width, 300, and all this is doing is it allows you to do an object based versus putting everything on the component. So that way, if you want, you can separate out your styles. You can reuse your styles across multiple components. But all the properties that you put in here are the exact same properties that you would put on the view tag or text tag itself. And there are different styles that you can use. So headline styles, there are node styles is the TypeScript definition for this. So I'm just going to import this real quick. And then text, this is text down here. There are text styles that you can use for the TypeScript definitions. And let's see, hopefully that works. Let's see. Oh, it's angry about some kind of font, or one of these properties is actually probably invalid. I will look at that later. But again, you get TypeScript definitions. We got our component that's being returned. And so I want to talk about a few special ones. So this is our first special one that we're running into is show. And we are using SolidJS. And because we're using SolidJS, we get all the power of SolidJS. So here is SolidJS. We can go through the documentation and we can look at the get started. Actually, I like to go over to the quick reference here. And we can look at, these are the components that are built into SolidJS. So the show one is our like if statement. So we can have show when, and what happens is we pass in a variable, props.content.voteCount. So when there is vote count, create this component. If there's no vote count, it does not create that component. So there's no additional processing. That component just does not exist. And that's what show does, is it allows you to dynamically create components based on data that you're getting back. All right, let's go back into our TMDB. Gone through a few different components. This is another advanced component, the lazy up. And I will try to explain this as best I can, but we have a column component. So there's another video about row and column that will give you more details about that. Hopefully you saw that video. But if not, row and column is what allows us to go right and left and up and down. So column is up and down, row is right and left. Hopefully, vertical, horizontal, that's what that does. But the lazy up component, what it does is it has this up count property. And so right now, if we look at the column, there's a whole bunch of rows here. There's like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 rows. Rather than creating all 7 rows when the page first loads, the lazy up component will only create up count. So it will only create the first 2 rows. And then as you navigate down, it will lazy create the next row. So it's intercepting the on down key handler. And when you press on down, it takes the each, which is the rows. So this is the list of all the rows, and it just adds one more item onto the row. So that way the next row gets created as soon as the user presses down. And so I have the same thing here for the row component, because again, we have 10 items in the row that we're displaying, but as we navigate right, it's creating one poster every time you navigate right. So rather than creating all 20 of the posters when you first initially load, it's only creating 7 or 8, and then it will create more as the user navigates. So this is a good lazy pattern to speed up the initial rendering of the screen and to limit the amount of stuff that is actually loading when the page starts. So that is all the lazy up component is done. It's a wrapper around dynamic, and you can pass in column or row, and then you have a for loop that is inside of it. So it just loops through the each items and creates whatever component that you want underneath. So here we have the outer column, and then we have the inner row. So that's creating all of our rows. And then inside of our rows, we have two different row types. We have a hero row type, and we have a title row type. That was fun, title row type. So you'll notice there's this big one, which is our hero row. And then this is our title row. And we can switch between the two of them just by using an inline ternary operator to check, like, is it a hero type? Then display the hero type of the row. Otherwise, do a title row. And now we can switch between the two. So that is essentially it for the UI portion of this. There's not too much going on here. We can go into our hero component real quick. So again, we have another function, which is hero. We can set custom props for our TypeScript definition. And then this is returning a view, spreading the props. We have on focus change. We have some focus states. So let's talk a little bit about that. So you'll notice our hero component up here is when it receives focus, it's displaying another poster and it's displaying the text. And how does that all work? So we have an on focus change and we're setting a signal. So we have a signal that's just a Boolean. So now on focus change, the first argument is the Boolean of does this thing have focus or not? So now you have a signal that says if this thing has focus, we can change props. So we can set the alpha of the innards, we'll say the innards of the hero component to be alpha 0 when it doesn't have focus. So when it loses focus, all that stuff is just setting alpha to 0, and you see it has a nice fade effect. And that's because we have a transition on alpha that will do this hero transition. So if we go up to hero transition, let's look for the definition of that property real quick. So we go to hero transition. It's just doing a duration with a cubic Bezier function to fade it out. And that's all there is to it. So we have now, if this thing has focus, set the alpha to 1, otherwise set it to 0, and that does our fade in effect. Focus is called by the focus manager. So it sets focus to this. I'm going to have another follow-up video just about focus because I think that's a really interesting topic that a lot of people get confused about, but I will explain that in another video, so stay tuned. But we have forward states. So this thing is receiving focus. It's also setting focus state to all the components on here, which probably isn't needed because none of these are actually using focus. I could probably remove this. But yeah, this is just another component with text. We're setting the text with the X, Y values of where we want elements on the screen. And focus is changing the alpha value. And then there's also, you can see how when it focuses, the whole image kind of scales and gets a little bigger. So we can see that's part of hero styles. There is a state on here, which is $focus, so that when the poster receives focus, it's going to scale up to a size of 1.05. And then when it loses focus, it goes back to the default value that you have to set on the style object of scale 1. So it just scales back down. All right. One other thing that I will mention is right now I'm inside of a column and I'm pressing up and down to switch between the rows. And then I'm pressing right and left when I'm inside of the row. And that is built into row and column. Again, they have an on left and an on up and on down handler, which is then switching the child and setting focus to the next child. What happens is when I press left on the first item, you'll notice it goes to the left nav. And you're like, well, how does that work? How does it know to go here? So what the row and column and how key handling works is if you return false or you don't return true, meaning you didn't handle the key event, it will bubble up to the next key handler. So if we go back up into our app, you'll notice that up here, there is an on left. So the row got the on left, it did not handle it, so it returned false. Then that means this one gets called, and this one will say, okay, now focus the nav drawer. So that sets focus on the nav drawer, and then when we press right, it changes the focus back to the page container, which is this, which then forwards the focus back down into the page, which then goes all the way back down into the row and sets focus back on this element. So now we can kind of move between the elements. Okay, that is all that I have for this video. As always, please like and subscribe. Please add comments for what you want more information about. I'm happy to create more videos. I hope this was useful, and stay tuned for a focus video. Thank you.